The Western Australian government has announced that it will fund immunisation for 15 to 19-year-olds against an emerging meningitis germ called Meningococcus W, or NW. They've done this because of the rise of numbers in WA, albeit still small. But MenW is potentially nasty and is in epidemic proportions in South America, where the death rate is claimed to be as high as 28%. And paradoxically, MenW may not show itself as meningitis. We'll come to that in a moment. Someone who studies such infections is Professor Jodie McVernon, who's Director of Epidemiology at the Doherty Institute for Infection and Immunity in Melbourne. Welcome to the Health Report.
Thanks, Norman.
So what are the numbers of MenW in Australia? Because it's happening in Victoria as well, isn't it?
Yes, well, we certainly have seen an increase in the proportion of meningococcal cases that are MenW in Australia over the last couple of years, which is really the basis of the concern in WA at the present time. That said, we need to kind of put it in context. So back in 2002, when we had an epidemic of MenC, which was a very serious form of meningococcus at that time, we had almost 800 cases a year in Australia of meningococcus overall. And last year there were only about 260 cases around the country. So one of the
of
MenC. Of meningococcus total. So this is part of the tricky story here, is that meningococcus is the bug that causes, meningitis that we're aware of, but they're not all created equal. So they have these different names. So we talk about MenC and B and W. These are different subgroups.
And we immunise at 12 months against meningococcal C.
That's right. And the meningococcal C program was introduced because of those very high numbers back in the early 2000s, and it's been incredibly successful at pretty much eliminating MenC from Australia. What we had after MenC was gone was mainly due to a bug called B, so MenB, which was a different part of the family. But this rise in MenW has only really occurred in the last few years. And as you say, it mirrors what's happened in South America and also in the UK and Europe, where similar trends have been observed.
Now, just describe what happens, because most meningococcal infection can either be a rash, a fever, stiff neck, don't like the light, you're heading for meningitis or a septicemia. But MenW can present as something I haven't seen since, I was a newly graduated doctor, which is epiglottitis, which is where you get a blocked throat infection, which can be life-threatening. You can get arthritis. It's not necessarily meningitis that meningococcal W causes.
Yeah, there has been this description of atypical presentation, some people coming in with more of a sort of gastro-y type illness. So it's something that practitioners need to be vigilant for. It's also mostly affected in Australia so far an older age group than classic meningococcal disease, which usually peaks in sort of young infants and teenage years. And the early cases in Australia were also mainly in people in their 50s and 60s. So there are a few things about it that are a little bit different, and that's something that obviously is being watched very closely nationally.
And do we know why it's emerging? Is it just that it's spread from South America somehow, a bit like other infections go global?
So as I said before, meningococci aren't all created equal. There's a whole family of organisms that make up this group of bugs. And we talk about them as A, B, C and W, but that's kind of like saying I drive a red car or a green car or a blue car. I alluded to the fact that the MenW strain that we're seeing in all of these countries at the moment is actually a lot more like the MenC strain that emerged in Europe first in the late 90s and then did come to Australia and caused quite high numbers of cases here and led to a vaccine program. And so it's like saying, is a red or a blue Ferrari more alike than a red Ferrari and a blue Honda Civic? So the actual underlying core genes and things of the bugs mean that they behave differently, and the particular family, we call it clonal complex 11, it's just a name, of this MenW clone that's currently being seen in Australia seems to be a type of meningococcus that's better at being spread between people possibly, but also more likely than some other types to cause serious infections. And
Has immunisation caused the problem in a sense? In other words, that there's an ecological niche, if you like, for meningococcal infection. You get rid of C because of immunisation, then B emerges, then C and W and Y, because that's, there's just an empty space for it to inhabit, a bit like sparrows or, you know what I'm saying.
Yeah, look, it's a very relevant question, but there's no evidence that that's actually what's happening here. Overall, meningococcal disease in Australia was decreasing after serogroup C vaccine was introduced, and that's because even the B disease has also been slowly declining over time for
Even
reasons
though
we don't understand.
Even though that's not part of the national immunisation schedule.
That's right. So we got rid of C, and even B is sort of going down. But we know from looking at this organism and how it behaves in human populations over time that it does do this fluctuating thing over time. It's a moving target. So a new variant might emerge in a population. It spreads a little bit better. It has a bit of an advantage over another type, and so it will gradually rise to dominance in the population. And so in America, for example, in the last decade, they had an increase in serogroup Y meningococcus for reasons that aren't entirely clear. That hasn't spread to other countries. In New Zealand, in recent history, there was an outbreak of a serious clone of a MenB strain that didn't make it across to us. So we see these shifts in the bug. It's part of the way it behaves, and the strains shift around over time. And so this is why we just need to be really vigilant in monitoring what it's doing in order to see what the appropriate responses are.
And speaking of appropriate responses, the UK has funded a W vaccine, hasn't it?
It has. So the UK had already introduced a second dose of MenC vaccine for teenagers. And when they started to see emergence of this MenW strain, which spread very rapidly across the whole UK, they were able to just slot in a vaccine that covers against A, C, W and Y into the spot that they had for a vaccine there. So they were the first country, or South America, parts of South America saw this first and introduced a childhood vaccine. The UK followed closely after and decided to introduce a teenage vaccine.
And WA is doing it in the teenage years. Given it happens in older people, is that the right time to immunise?
The rationale for doing that, and the UK was very clear about why they chose to do what they did, is that the peak age at which people carry meningococci is in the teenage years. And when I say that, maybe 1 in 5 teenagers are walking around with a meningococcal bug up their noses, and they're perfectly healthy and fine. And the actual chance of the bug causing serious disease is very, very small. So we know from studies conducted overseas that the peak age at which people tend to have this bug up their nose is in the teenage years. And looking at meningococcal disease generally, as I said, there's sort of a peak in under 5s and another peak in the teenage years, which people have related to this very high rate of picking it up. And so for that reason, the UK program has targeted teenagers, and WA has followed suit in trying to reduce the people who are spreading the bug around potentially.
And very briefly, if you're not going to introduce immunisation, what's the best way of preventing meningitis outbreaks?
Well, I think, sort of should we come out of the house is probably not a sensible statement to make. This is still a very, very rare disease, and the main sort of measure for practitioners and for people to be aware of is, being vigilant to a high onset of fever. Meningococcus classically causes a typical rash, and it's a rash that doesn't blanch when you press on the skin. So there's a famous test called the glass test. If you press on the skin with a glass and you can still see the spots, that's a rash to go and get checked out very quickly. So sort of early vigilance and diagnosis is the thing. But other than that, it's sort of... There is no specific prevention, and at the moment, as you noted, the number of cases generally across the country are still small, although clearly have had a very dramatic impact on the individuals and families affected.
Jodie, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Professor Jodie McVernon is Director of Epidemiology at the Doherty Institute in Melbourne.